This is too big. The rancher froze when he saw the giant bride bathing at the lake. He'd sworn he'd never love again, never let another soul get close enough to leave a scar. But here she was, a stranger in his own water, towering, scarred, and unwanted by the whole damn world. She expected him to laugh, to jeer, to ride away like all the others, but instead, he offered her his coat. They called her a mistake. They called him a fool. But behind the whispers was a truth only they knew. Love doesn't measure inches. It measures courage. The creek ran silver in the fading light, the water as restless as the evening wind stirring through the cottonwoods. Fletcher Ward guided his horse down the bank, thinking only of the dust in his throat and the silence he wore like a second skin. It had been 5 years since laughter warmed the timbers of his house, 5 years since a voice softer than his own had lived beneath his roof. He had buried love and hope along with it, in a pine box beside a weeping willow, and he had sworn on that freshly turned earth that he would never, ever risk opening that wound again. But the West has a way of testing a man's promises. He heard the splash before he saw her. At first he figured it was a stray calf, or maybe a deer stepping down for a drink. He reined in his horse, his eyes narrowing toward the shimmer of the creek, and then every muscle in his body went rigid. A figure rose from the water, tall enough to blot out the horizon behind her. The last light of the setting sun clung to her wet skin, turning her into something not quite of this world, something carved out of legend. Half spirit, half storm. His breath hitched, caught somewhere in his chest. She turned, startled by the sound of hooves on stone. For a second, she looked like she might bolt, a cornered animal with nowhere to go. Her eyes locked with his, dark, wounded, but burning with a fierce light deep beneath the surface. Her shoulders were broad, her stance defiant, but he could see the tremor she was trying so hard to hide. The words slipped from his lips before he could stop them, rough and unplanned. This is too big. Her chin lifted, and in that tiny movement he saw it all, the shield she had built around herself, brick by painful brick, the bitter expectation that he would laugh, that he would be just like all the others. She had heard those words 1,000 times before, but never the way he meant them now. To her, they were knives. To him, they were awe. She didn't answer. She just stood there, water dripping from her powerful frame, daring him to speak again, to land the blow she knew was coming. But the blow never landed. Fletcher swung his leg over his horse, his boots thudding onto the damp earth. His hands, rough from years of rope and hammer, fumbled with the worn wool coat strapped to his saddle. He stepped forward, the ground sucking at his heels, and held it out. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raw, uncertain, "you'll catch your death out here. Take this." Her eyes widened, as if the gesture itself was a trick, a cruel joke with a punchline she hadn't figured out yet. For a long, silent second, she didn't move. He thought maybe she'd refuse it out of pure, stubborn pride. But then, slowly, her hand reached for the coat. Their fingers brushed, and a jolt, sharp and startling, shot up his arm and straight into his chest. For a split second, an image flashed behind his eyes, splintered wood, the orange glow of a fire, and a woman's terrified face. He pulled his hand back fast, unsettled, shaking his head like he could clear the vision away. She clutched the coat to her chest, wrapping it around her shoulders with a kind of reverence, as if it were made of velvet instead of old wool. Her lips parted, her voice low and gravelly. "You're not laughing." Fletcher met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Ain't nothing funny here." Her throat worked, and for the first time, he saw the wall around her crack, just a little. A flicker of something soft, hope, maybe, or just pure disbelief, crossed her face before she swallowed it back down. She stepped out of the water, dripping, the coat dragging heavy around her massive shoulders. She stood taller than him by a good hand's breadth, her shadow spilling long and dark across the bank, as the sun finally gave up and bled below the hills. He thought again of the whispers he'd heard in town weeks ago. A mail-order bride, meant for a rancher over in the next county. A woman too large, too awkward, left at the station like freight no man wanted to claim. They'd laughed about her at the saloon, raising their mugs and saying she'd vanished as quickly as she'd arrived. But she hadn't vanished. She was here, standing on his land, trembling, though she tried her best to hide it. "You lost?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Her voice carried the edge of a blade dulled by sorrow. "Aren't I always?" The words struck him harder than he expected. He knew loss, too. He lived with it every sunrise, every empty chair at his supper table. He shifted his weight, torn between turning his horse and riding on and stepping closer. Common sense screamed at him to leave her be, that she was trouble he didn't need. But something deeper, something older and more stubborn, rooted him right there to the spot. "You got a name?" "Eliza." She said it quick and quiet, like a secret she already regretted sharing. "Fletcher Ward." He tipped his hat. "My ranch is just up the ridge." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why are you telling me that?" He hesitated, searching for an honest answer that didn't sound like pity. "So you know there's a roof not too far from here, if you've got a mind to stay warm tonight." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Why? So the town can laugh at you too? So they can call you a fool for taking in the giant woman no other man would have?" The fire in her voice was sharp, but he heard the pain crackling underneath it. He thought of the gossip, of the way small towns could tear apart anything they didn't understand. He imagined the whispers if they saw her with him. Maybe she was right. Maybe they would call him a fool. He stepped closer anyway, his boots sinking deeper into the mud. "Let 'em laugh," he said, the words coming from a place he thought had died long ago. "They don't live my life. You can stay the night, just the one night." She studied him for a long time, her eyes flicking over his face, testing him for a lie, for the trap she was so sure was there. Finally, she gave a slow, reluctant nod. "One night." He helped her onto his horse. The animal shifted under her weight, but steadied with a firm hand on the reins. He mounted up behind her, careful to keep a respectful distance, though the warmth of her pressed against his chest all the same. They rode in silence, the clip-clop of hooves mixing with the rising song of the night crickets. The sky deepened to a dark velvet, pricked with stars like holes punched in a blanket. By the time the ranch house came into view, a faint firelight glowing in the window, Fletcher felt the weight of something heavy settling in his gut. He told himself it was just for tonight, a stranger in need. Nothing more. But the echo of her voice lingered in the air, and the strange spark from her touch still burned on his hand. This was more than just one night. And he already knew it. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers. He lit a lamp, and long dancing shadows leaped across the walls. Eliza stood just inside the doorway, dripping onto the floorboards, clutching his coat like a shield. He motioned toward the worn armchair near the hearth. "Sit." She lowered herself into it slowly, the old wood groaning under her frame. She stretched her hands toward the fire, her eyes closing as the warmth kissed her skin. For the first time since he'd seen her, she looked less like a mountain defying a storm and more like a woman who was just bone-tired. Fletcher poured coffee from the pot on the stove and set a steaming cup on the small table beside her. She stared at it, then up at him, her brow furrowed. "You don't even know me." He leaned against the stone mantel, his arms folded across his chest. "Don't need to. Cold is cold. Hunger's hunger. That's enough to know for now." Her lips trembled just for a second before she pressed them into a firm line. She lifted the cup with both hands, sipping the hot liquid slowly. Steam curled around her face, softening the hard edges of her defiance. Fletcher turned his gaze back to the flames, the steady crackle filling the heavy silence between them. He told himself again and again that it was just for one night, that tomorrow she would be gone, and the silence would return. But deep down, in that quiet, broken part of him, he knew. Nothing about this night, or this woman, was ever going to leave him unchanged. The wind rattled the shutters, whistling a low, lonely tune through the gaps in the old wood. Fletcher shoved another log into the fire, and a shower of sparks snapped up the chimney. The new flames spread a warm glow across the room, glinting off the iron pot and the stack of tin plates on the counter. He wasn't used to company. His house, like his heart, had grown hard and accustomed to silence. Now the silence felt different. It felt charged, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Eliza sat in the chair, her big hands wrapped around the coffee cup, her eyes fixed on the fire. The steam curled past her cheeks, but her gaze was 1,000 miles away. Fletcher leaned against the mantel, watching her without meaning to, wondering what kind of cruel road had carved such a deep weariness into her shoulders. She broke the quiet first, her voice steadier now, as if the warmth had melted a sliver of her armor. "You think you're doing me a kindness," she said, not looking at him. "But men don't keep kindness, not for long." Fletcher's jaw tightened. "Not all men." She gave a small, bitter laugh that didn't have a trace of humor in it. "All the ones I've met." She set the cup down, her fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the wooden table. "They see me, and they see a joke, a giant, a sideshow freak, a burden no man would ever willingly claim, even the one who sent for me. When I stepped off that coach, he took one look and turned his back like I was spoiled goods he wouldn't even touch." Her words were meant to be sharp, but the edges trembled with a hurt so deep it was almost a physical thing. Fletcher stared at her, the firelight painting deep lines across his weathered face. He thought of the men back at the saloon, the way they had snickered into their mugs, the cruel delight in their voices as they'd talked about the giant bride. He had said nothing then, just kept his head down like he always did. But now, with her sitting in his chair, her scars laid bare by the firelight, he wished he had stood up and smashed their sneering faces in. "You're not a joke," he said, the words simple and plain. She blinked, startled, as if the directness of it surprised her more than any flowery compliment would have. "You don't even know me." "I don't need to," Fletcher replied, his voice firm. "I know enough." Her eyes lingered on him, searching for something, but she said no more. Instead, she drew his old coat tighter around herself, sinking deeper into the chair. The firelight softened her, making her look less like the mountain he had first seen in the creek, and more like a woman worn thin by too many storms. Fletcher moved toward a shelf and pulled down a thick wool blanket. He laid it gently over the back of her chair. "You can take the bed." Her head jerked up, her eyes wide with alarm. "No." He raised a brow. "It's warmer and you're cold. I've slept on dirt floors before. A chair by the fire is a luxury." Fletcher sighed, running a hand through his dusty hair. "Eliza, I ain't about to let a guest sleep sitting up. Not under my roof." Her lips pressed into a tight, stubborn line. She wanted to argue, he could see it, but the sheer weight of her exhaustion was heavier than her pride. Slowly, reluctantly, she nodded. "Just the one night." "Just the one night," he echoed, though the words felt like a lie on his tongue. He put a pillow and another blanket on the bed in the small side room, stepping back as she walked past him. Even in the close confines of his house, she seemed to fill the space, her presence too large for walls that had only known his solitary shadow for years. She paused in the doorway, her hand brushing against the frame, and she looked back at him. For the briefest of moments, he saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, the fear that when she woke, he might be gone, or worse, that he might have changed his mind and become like all the others. But Fletcher only tipped his hat, muttered a rough "good night," and settled himself in the armchair by the fire. He lay awake long after the flames had died down to glowing embers, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the quiet, unfamiliar shifts of the house. He heard her turn over in the bed, a soft sigh escaping her lips. He wondered what she was running from. He wondered what she was running to. He told himself it was only one night, that he was a fool for letting a stray in. But the whisper of her bitter laugh, the tremor in her voice, the way she had clutched his coat like a lifeline, those things lingered, unsettling him, pulling at something he had buried 5 years ago in a pine box under a willow tree. And as the first hint of gray dawn touched the window, Fletcher realized he wasn't just offering a stranger a roof for the night. He was offering a piece of himself, and he was terrified she was going to break it. Just before dawn, Fletcher was jolted awake by a sound he hadn't heard in years, the soft thud of someone working dough in his kitchen. He found her there, hair still damp from the night before, the sleeves of one of his old shirts rolled up to her powerful elbows. Flour dusted her cheek. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice still rough with sleep. She glanced up, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "I figured I'd earn my keep. For the night." Fletcher leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, watching her hands knead the dough with a strength that seemed both effortless and practiced. The sight stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt in a long, long time, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a memory of what it felt like to wake up to more than just silence. "You don't owe me anything," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. Her lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. It was the grimace of someone who knew the world better than he did. "The world doesn't work that way, Mr. Ward. Kindness always has a price." He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the look in her eyes stopped him cold. It wasn't bitterness he saw there. It was a truth that had been carved into her by too many wounds. Soon the smell of fresh bread filled the small house, mingling with the smoke from the morning fire. Fletcher set 2 mugs of coffee on the table. They ate in a tense silence, the only sound the crackle of the bread's crust as they broke it apart. She ate like someone unused to having plenty, each bite careful, almost apologetic. After a while, she looked up, her gaze fixed on something over his shoulder. "I should go." The words hit him like a physical blow. He set his cup down, staring at her. 100 different arguments rose in his throat. He wanted to tell her she didn't have to leave, that she could stay, that maybe the walls of his house felt stronger with her inside them. But his throat closed around the words, choking them back down. Instead, he just asked, "Where will you go?" Her eyes dropped to the table. "Does it matter?" Yes, he thought, it matters to me. But he didn't say it. Outside, the sun was climbing over the ridge, spilling liquid gold across the land. Somewhere in town, men would be talking, laughing, spreading their small, cruel stories. And here, in his kitchen, sat the woman they mocked as a mistake. He didn't know it yet, but in that quiet, sun-drenched moment, a choice had already been made. He wasn't just giving her shelter anymore. He was taking a side. But then there was a knock at the door. Sharp, impatient. Fletcher and Eliza both froze. Nobody ever came out to his ranch. Nobody. He glanced at her, saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. She thought it was someone for her. He grabbed the old shotgun he kept by the door, his movements slow and deliberate. He cracked the door open just enough to see. Standing on his porch was Silas Blackwood, the rancher from the next county, the man who was supposed to marry Eliza. He wasn't big or imposing. He was small and neat, with cold, calculating eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. "Ward," Blackwood said, his voice smooth as oil, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Fletcher's hand tightened on the shotgun. He glanced back at Eliza. She was as still as a statue, her face drained of all color. This wasn't just a jilted groom. This was the man she had run from, and he had found her. The price of kindness, she had said. It looked like the bill was coming due. Silas Blackwood's smile widened, but it was all teeth. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding," he said, his eyes flicking past Fletcher to where Eliza stood, frozen, in the middle of the room. "My bride took fright. The long journey, you understand. I've been searching for her." He spoke as if she were a prize mare that had bolted from its paddock. Fletcher kept his body framed in the doorway, the shotgun held loosely but ready. "She don't look lost to me. She looks like she's right where she wants to be." Blackwood's eyes narrowed, the charming facade cracking for just a second. "That's my property you're harboring, Ward. The contract is paid. The preacher's waiting. I've come to collect what's mine." "She ain't a sack of grain, Blackwood," Fletcher growled. "She's a woman. She can choose for herself." Blackwood chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Oh, I don't think you want to get involved in this. I'm a reasonable man, but I don't take kindly to thieves." He let the word hang in the air, a direct threat. He glanced at Eliza again, and his smile returned, but it was laced with something ugly. "Come along, dear. We'll forget this little adventure ever happened." Eliza didn't move. Her breathing was shallow, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. Fletcher saw the terror in her eyes, but underneath it, something else was stirring, a slow-burning fire. "I'm not going with you," she said, her voice trembling but clear. Blackwood's face darkened. "Don't be a fool. Where else will you go? Who else would have you?" He looked her up and down with open disgust. "You should be grateful I'm willing to overlook your shortcomings." That was it. The fire in Fletcher's gut roared to life. "I think you should leave," he said, his voice dangerously low. He raised the shotgun just an inch. Blackwood stared at the gun, then back at Fletcher, a look of disbelief on his face. "For her? You'd make an enemy of me for that?" He laughed again, louder this time. "You really are a fool, Ward. You have no idea what you're getting into." He tipped his hat in a mocking gesture. "Fine, keep her for now. But everything has a price. You'll find out soon enough what hers is." He turned and walked away, his boot steps unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Fletcher watched until Blackwood was on his horse and riding away, a small, dark figure against the vast landscape. He closed the door and leaned against it, the adrenaline slowly draining out of him, leaving him shaky. He turned to look at Eliza. She was still standing in the same spot, her face pale. "You should have let him take me," she whispered. "He'll ruin you." "Let him try," Fletcher said, the words tasting like rust and resolution. He had just declared war on the most powerful man in the county. For a woman he'd known for less than a day, for a feeling he hadn't let himself feel in 5 long years. The silence in the house was back, but it was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the heavy weight of what was coming. That night, Eliza couldn't settle. She paced the small main room like a caged animal, her large frame making the floorboards creak with every step. "This is my fault," she kept saying, more to herself than to him. "I brought this to your door." "You brought yourself to my door," Fletcher corrected her, cleaning the shotgun at the kitchen table, the metallic clicks echoing in the tense quiet. Blackwood did the rest. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the flickering lamplight. "Why'd you run from him, Eliza? What did he do?" She stopped pacing and wrapped her arms around herself. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, her voice a low, haunted whisper. "The agency, they write letters, you know. They make the men sound decent, kind. Blackwood's letters spoke of a partnership, of building a life." She gave a hollow laugh. "When I met him at the station, the first thing he did was hand me a list of chores. He didn't look at my face. He looked at my hands, my arms, like a farmer buying a new ox." She shuddered, the memory vivid and ugly. "That night at his ranch, it was worse. He has Other workers. People who look as lost as I felt. He told me I wouldn't be working in the house. I'd be working in the fields and keeping the others in line. Her voice dropped even lower. He showed me a whip. He said my size would be a good deterrent. Fletcher's hands stilled on the gun. A cold fury, different from the hot anger he'd felt earlier, settled deep in his bones. There was a girl there, Eliza continued, her eyes distant. Small, scared. She had bruises on her face. She tried to warn me, just with her eyes. I knew if I stayed, I'd either become a monster like him or I'd end up like her. So I waited until they were asleep, and I ran. I just ran until I couldn't run anymore. And I ended up at your creek. Now he understood the vision he'd had. The fire, the terrified face. It wasn't his memory, it was hers. A flash of her terror, somehow transmitted through that simple touch. He put the cleaning rag down. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He stood up and walked over to her. He didn't touch her, just stood in front of her. "He's not just a rancher, is he?" She shook her head, a tear finally tracing a path through the flower still on her cheek. "He owns everything, the town, the sheriff. Everyone is afraid of him." "Not everyone," Fletcher said. He thought of his wife, Sarah, so full of fire and life. She would have stood up to a man like Blackwood. She would have spit in his eye. For 5 years, he had honored her memory with silence and grief. But maybe the best way to honor her was with a fight. "He said he'd ruin me," Fletcher said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Man can't ruin something that's already broken." He looked at her, at the strength in her shoulders and the fear in her eyes, and for the first time he felt a crack in the ice that had encased his heart. "We'll face him. Together." The word hung in the air between them. Together. It was a promise and a threat. The next morning, Fletcher found one of his fences cut. The cattle had wandered out toward the canyon. It took them half the day to round them up. It wasn't an accident. It was a message from Blackwood. "I can touch you whenever I want." Eliza worked beside him, her strength a constant surprise. She hoisted fence posts that usually took 2 men, her movements sure and steady. But he saw the guilt in her eyes, the fear. "We need to go to town," Fletcher said that afternoon, his jaw set. "We need supplies, and I need to send a telegram." "To who?" "To the only law Blackwood doesn't own," he said. "A U.S. Marshal I knew a few years back. It's a long shot he'll even get the message, but it's the only shot we've got." The ride into town was tense. When they walked down the dusty main street, everything stopped. Men paused their conversations. Women froze with their baskets in their hands. Children gawked, pointing openly at the giant woman walking beside the quiet rancher who never spoke to anyone. The whispers followed them like a swarm of angry bees. "That's her. The one Blackwood was after. Look at the size of her. No wonder he sent her packing." Ward's lost his mind, taken up with that. Eliza's chin was high, her eyes fixed forward, but Fletcher saw the way her fists were clenched, the way her knuckles were white. He felt a hot shame crawl up his neck, not for her, but for the town, for their small, mean-spirited hearts. At the general store, the clerk, a greasy man named Peters, smirked at them. "Well, well, Ward, didn't think you were the type to bring home a stray from the circus." Fletcher's hands stilled on the counter. The room went quiet. He could feel Eliza stiffen beside him, bracing for the inevitable humiliation. But Fletcher didn't laugh. He didn't look away. He leaned in close to the clerk, his voice low and steady as a rock slide. "She's with me. You got a problem with that?" The smirk on Peter's face faltered. He looked into Fletcher's eyes and saw something there that made him take a step back. "No. No problem, Ward." He shoved the ledger forward for Fletcher to sign. As they stepped back outside, Fletcher caught the quick, startled glance Eliza gave him. It was a look of gratitude, yes, but also of pure disbelief. No one had ever stood up for her before. Not ever. But as they rode out of town, Fletcher saw Peters scurry out of the store and head straight for the sheriff's office. The same office that had a direct telegraph line to Blackwood's ranch. The lines were being drawn, and he and Eliza were on the wrong side of them. The small acts of terror continued. A well was fouled with oil, discovered just before the cattle drank from it. The door to the smokehouse was broken, the winter's supply of meat stolen. They were little things designed to wear them down, to make Fletcher's life impossible. Each incident carved a new line of worry onto Fletcher's face and deepened the guilt in Eliza's eyes. "This is my fault," she said one evening, staring into the fire. "If I leave, he'll stop." "No, he won't," Fletcher said, his voice grim. "This ain't about you anymore. It's about him showing everyone that what he wants, he gets. If you leave, he'll hunt you down. And he'll still come for me, just for the insult." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "We're in this now, both of us." A week after their trip to town, the sheriff rode out. He was a big, slovenly man named Calloway, with a stained vest and a permanent sneer. He didn't dismount, just sat on his horse, looking down at them. "Ward," he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Fletcher's boots. "Blackwood filed a complaint. Says you're holding his property." "She's not property, Calloway, and you know it." The sheriff shrugged. "Don't matter what I know. Matters what the paper says. He's got a mail order contract, signed and paid for. Legally, she belongs to him until that contract is dissolved. He wants her back. Says you're interfering." "And if I don't give her back?" Fletcher asked, his hand resting on the axe handle he'd been using to chop wood. "Then I'll have to come back with a warrant. For theft. And I'll have to deputize some of Blackwood's boys to help me serve it." The threat was clear. It wouldn't be an arrest. It would be a slaughter. He tipped his hat. "You got 24 hours to bring her in. Don't make this harder than it has to be." He rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and dread hanging in the air. Eliza sank onto the porch steps, her face in her hands. "He's got the law on his side," she choked out. "We can't win." Fletcher stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle. He thought about the telegram he'd sent. There had been no reply. They were alone. The law, the town, all of it was aligned against them. He looked at Eliza, at her broad, shaking shoulders. He remembered her standing in the creek, defiant and terrified. He remembered the feel of her hand, the spark that had shown him her fear. He walked over and sat down beside her on the step. It was the closest he'd been to her since that first night. "My wife, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice rusty from disuse. She was a healer. Used herbs and old remedies. People in town thought she was strange, but she helped them anyway. She never backed down from a fight if she thought she was right. He paused, the memory a sharp pain in his chest. She wouldn't have backed down from this. He looked out at the ridge, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in angry shades of red and orange. Blackwood wants a fight. He's going to get one. But as he spoke the brave words, a cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach. It wasn't just about his land anymore. It was about her. He had let someone in, just a crack, and now the whole world was trying to smash the door down. What if he couldn't protect her? What if the cost of his kindness was her life? That night, sleep was impossible. Fletcher sat in his chair, the shotgun across his lap, watching the shadows and listening to every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind. Eliza was in the side room, but he knew she was awake, too. The whole house was awake, waiting. Around midnight, he heard a floorboard creak behind him. He turned, the shotgun coming up fast. It was Eliza, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide in the dim moonlight slanting through the window. "I can't just wait," she whispered. "There has to be something we can do." Fletcher lowered the gun. "There's nothing to do but wait for Calloway and his dogs." No, she said, her voice gaining a bit of strength. Before I ran from Blackwood's ranch, I saw something. In his office. He was away, and I was cleaning. He has a ledger, a big, leather-bound book. He keeps records of everything in it. Not just cattle sales, names, dates, payments. I saw the name of the girl with the bruised face, and other names. Next to them were figures listed as losses. Fletcher stared at her, his mind racing. Losses? He wasn't just bringing women here to be his wife, she said, the horrible truth dawning on both of them. He was selling them, like cattle, and the ones who fought back or who weren't suitable, he wrote them off. The cold fury from before came back, 10 times stronger. This was bigger than a stolen bride. This was slavery, maybe even murder. That book, Fletcher said, his voice a low growl. If we had that book, we could ruin him, Eliza finished. We could show everyone what he really is. A crazy, desperate plan began to form in Fletcher's mind. Blackwood and Calloway would be expecting him to fortify the ranch, to wait for their attack. They wouldn't expect him to go on the offensive. They wouldn't expect him to ride straight into the lion's den. His ranch is a fortress, Eliza said, as if reading his thoughts. He has a dozen men, maybe more. They'll all be riding here tomorrow with the sheriff, Fletcher countered. His ranch will be empty, or close to it. He stood up, the plan solidifying. You'll stay here, barricade the door. If they get here before I get back. No, Eliza said, her voice firm, unwavering. You don't know the layout of the house. You don't know where he keeps the book. I do. She stood to her full height, seeming to fill the entire room. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. You said we'd face him together. This is together. He looked at her, at this giant, broken, beautiful woman who had stumbled into his life and set it on fire. He saw the courage in her, a courage that shamed his own years of hiding from the world. He gave a single, sharp nod. All right. Together. Hours before dawn they rode out, not toward town, but across the dark, rolling hills toward Blackwood's territory. The fate of their lives, and the lives of who knew how many other lost souls, depended on a leather-bound book hidden in the heart of their enemy's fortress. They were 2 outcasts against an army. The odds were impossible, and they wouldn't have it any other way. They left their horses in a thicket of mesquite a mile from Blackwood's ranch and crept forward on foot as the sky began to turn from black to a bruised purple. The ranch was bigger than Fletcher's, with a large main house, multiple bunkhouses, and sprawling corrals. As Fletcher had predicted, it was eerily quiet. A few sleepy-eyed hands tended to the horses, but the main force was clearly gone, likely already riding toward town to meet up with Sheriff Calloway. His office is on the ground floor, at the back of the house, Eliza whispered, her breath fogging in the cold morning air. The window is usually left unlocked. They moved like ghosts, sticking to the shadows along the bunkhouse walls. A dog barked once, lazily, then went quiet. The air was thick with tension. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot. They reached the back of the main house. Eliza pointed to a window. Sure enough, it was slightly ajar. Fletcher, his heart pounding against his ribs, hoisted himself up and slipped inside, landing silently on a plush rug. The room smelled of expensive leather, cigar smoke, and cruelty. A massive oak desk dominated the space. Fletcher waved Eliza in after him. Her size made the entry more difficult, but she moved with a surprising grace, making almost no noise as she squeezed through the opening. The desk, she whispered, pointing. There's a hidden compartment on the left side. While Eliza worked on the desk, her large, surprisingly nimble fingers searching for the hidden catch, Fletcher stood guard at the door, peering through the crack into the main hall. He could hear someone moving around upstairs. A cook, maybe. They didn't have much time. Got it, Eliza breathed. A section of the desk's ornate scrollwork clicked open, revealing a small, dark cavity. Inside was the ledger. It was heavy, bound in dark red leather, with SB embossed in gold on the cover. She pulled it out and tucked it inside her shirt, the book a hard, cold rectangle against her skin. "Let's go," Fletcher mouthed, turning back toward the window. But it was too late. Heavy footsteps were coming down the main staircase. They were trapped. There was no time to get back out the window. Fletcher frantically scanned the room. There was a tall, curtained wardrobe in the corner. "In here," he hissed, shoving Eliza toward it. They squeezed inside, pulling the heavy doors shut just as the office door swung open. They stood in the suffocating darkness, shoulder to shoulder, barely daring to breathe. The book was a solid weight between them. Fletcher could smell the soap on Eliza's skin, feel the warmth radiating from her. Silas Blackwood walked into the room, humming a cheerful tune. He wasn't with the posse. He had stayed behind. The plan was in ruins. Through a thin crack in the wardrobe door, Fletcher could see Blackwood pour himself a drink at the small bar against the wall. He seemed relaxed, confident. He was letting Calloway and his thugs do the dirty work. He probably planned to ride over to Fletcher's ranch later to survey the damage and collect his prize. Fletcher's hand went to the pistol tucked in his belt. He could end it right now. One shot. But he knew it would be suicide. Blackwood's men would be on them in seconds, and the ledger, the proof they needed, would be lost. They had to get out. With the book. Blackwood sat down at his desk, sipping his drink. He seemed to notice something was amiss. His eyes scanned the room slowly. Did Fletcher leave a footprint? Did Eliza disturb something? His gaze settled on the window they had come through. He stood up and walked over to it, his boots silent on the thick rug. He saw the scuff marks on the sill. His body went tense. "Henry!" he bellowed. "Get in here!" Footsteps thundered through the house. A big, ugly-looking man with a drooping mustache burst into the room, a gun already in his hand. "Someone's been in here!" Blackwood snarled. "Check the grounds! Now!" As Henry rushed out, Blackwood's eyes swept the room again, this time with a hunter's intensity. He was searching for a hiding place. His eyes passed over the wardrobe, lingered for a heart-stopping second, and then moved on. He seemed to dismiss it. But then he stopped. He turned back slowly. He had seen the small patch of mud on the rug right in front of the wardrobe door, a tiny speck they had missed. He smiled, a slow, predatory smile. He walked over to the desk and pulled open a drawer. He took out a pistol, a beautiful silver-inlaid Colt, and cocked it. The sound was deafening in the silence of the room. He walked toward the wardrobe. Come out, wherever you are," he said in a sing-song voice. Inside the dark, cramped space, Eliza was shaking. Fletcher put a hand on her arm to steady her. He drew his own gun. This was it. They weren't getting out of here alive, but they were taking him with them. Just as Blackwood reached for the handle, a frantic shout came from outside. "Boss, Ryder's comin'." Blackwood froze. "Calloway? He's back already?" "No, sir. It ain't him. It's lawmen. Federal marshals, maybe." A look of pure fury crossed Blackwood's face. He glared at the wardrobe, then back toward the front of the house. He was caught. He couldn't afford to be found in a shootout with federal agents on his doorstep. He had to play the part of the respectable citizen. "Damn it!" he swore, lowering his gun. He strode out of the office, shouting orders. "Stall them! Find out what they want!" The moment he was gone, Fletcher pushed open the wardrobe door. "Now!" he whispered. They scrambled out of the office, out the window, and sprinted for the cover of the trees, the sounds of shouting and confusion erupting behind them. They didn't stop running until they reached their horses, their lungs burning, their hearts hammering. The telegram. Fletcher's telegram had gotten through. Help had arrived. But it had arrived at the wrong place. and Blackwood would know, without a doubt, who had called them. He would also know who had been in his office, and what they had taken. The game had changed. It wasn't about intimidation and threats anymore. Blackwood would come for them now, not with the law, but with guns and killers, to get his ledger back and to bury his secrets forever. They rode like the devil was on their heels, pushing the horses harder than they should have. The sun was high in the sky now, beating down on them. Every shadow looked like one of Blackwood's men. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. "The marshals," Eliza said, her voice strained as they galloped side by side. "They won't know to come to your ranch. They'll waste time at Blackwood's." "I know," Fletcher yelled back over the wind. "We're on our own for now." They were halfway back to the ranch when they saw it. A pillar of thick black smoke rising into the clear blue sky, rising from the exact spot where Fletcher's small, quiet house stood. Calloway and his men hadn't waited. They had come early. A cold, sick dread washed over Fletcher. He spurred his horse on, Eliza right beside him. They crested the final ridge and pulled up short, their hearts sinking. The house was gone. The fire had consumed it, leaving only a blackened, smoking frame. The barn was ablaze, the flames licking hungrily at the dry timber. Sheriff Calloway and a dozen of Blackwood's men were systematically destroying everything. They were shooting his remaining cattle, tearing down his fences, wiping him off the map. They hadn't found him and Eliza there, so they were erasing any reason for them to ever come back. Fletcher watched, his face a mask of stone, as 5 years of his life, 5 years of his grief and his solitude, burned to the ground. Everything he had, everything he was, turning to ash. He felt a hand on his arm. It was Eliza. Her face was grim, her eyes reflecting the flames, but she wasn't looking at the fire. She was looking at him. "It's just wood," she said, her voice low but fierce. "It's just a house. We're still alive." He looked at the smoldering ruins, then at her. She was right. He had lost a house, but for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel alone. The emptiness he had carried for 5 years was gone, replaced by a white-hot, righteous anger, and by her. "They're not finished," he said, his voice a low growl. "They'll hunt us now." As if on cue, one of the men down below pointed up at the ridge. They'd been spotted. A chorus of triumphant shouts went up. Calloway and his posse mounted their horses, their guns drawn, and started up the slope toward them. There was nowhere left to run. This was the end of the line. "Go," Fletcher said, turning to Eliza. "Take the ledger and ride. Get it to the marshals. I'll hold them off here as long as I can." Eliza looked at him, her jaw set in a stubborn line he was coming to know very well. "I told you once before, Fletcher Ward," she said, pulling her own horse around to face the charging men. "Together." He looked at her, this impossible woman. She wasn't just his ally anymore, she was his partner. He gave her a grim, tight smile. "All right then. Together." He pulled his rifle from its scabbard. She had no weapon, but she sat her horse like a queen, her shoulders squared, ready to face an army with nothing but her own indomitable will. Fletcher fired a shot over the heads of the charging riders, forcing them to slow down, to seek cover. The battle for their lives had begun, on a lonely ridge, under a sky black with smoke. The ridge offered little cover, just a few scattered boulders and thorny scrub brush. Calloway's men fanned out, dismounting and advancing on foot, using the terrain to their advantage. Bullets started whining past Fletcher's head, chipping splinters of rock off the boulder he was crouched behind. He returned fire, his shots measured and careful. He wasn't trying to kill them, not yet, just trying to slow them down, to buy time they didn't have. "We can't stay here," Eliza shouted over the gunfire. "They'll surround us." She was right. He scanned the landscape desperately. To their back was a steep drop into a rocky canyon. To their sides, open ground. Their only path was forward, through the men hunting them. It was a suicide run. Then he saw it. A narrow game trail, almost invisible, leading down the side of the canyon. It was a treacherous path, barely wide enough for a single horse, but it was their only chance. "Follow me!" he yelled, grabbing the reins of his horse. He spurred the animal toward the canyon edge, bullets kicking up dust around its hooves. He plunged down the trail, the horse slipping and sliding on the loose scree. He glanced back. Eliza was right behind him, her face set, her big horse handling the dangerous terrain with surprising agility. The men on the ridge cursed and fired after them, but the angle was too steep. For a moment, it seemed like they had made it, but Calloway was smarter than Fletcher gave him credit for. He sent half his men riding hard along the canyon rim, trying to get ahead of them, to cut them off at the bottom. The chase was on. They raced down the winding canyon floor, the rock walls echoing the thunder of their horses' hooves. They were exposed, a perfect target for the men firing down from above. Fletcher felt a searing pain in his left arm and realized he'd been hit. The wound wasn't deep, but blood was soaking his sleeve, and his arm was going numb. They rounded a sharp bend and saw Calloway's men ahead, dismounted, blocking the canyon. They were trapped between two groups. Fletcher pulled his horse to a skidding halt. This was it, the end. But Eliza didn't stop. With a wild cry, she urged her horse forward, straight toward the blockade. The men, stunned by her sheer audacity and the sight of this giant woman charging at them like a force of nature, hesitated for a split second. That was all she needed. Her horse slammed into their makeshift barricade of rocks and deadfall. But just before impact, Eliza did something Fletcher would never forget. She rose in the stirrups and launched herself off the horse, her body flying through the air and crashing down into the middle of the stunned gunmen. It was chaos. She was a whirlwind of fists and fury. She tossed one man aside like a rag doll. She grabbed another's rifle and snapped it in two over her knee. Her size, for so long a source of shame and ridicule, had become a devastating weapon. She wasn't a freak. She was a warrior. Fletcher, shaking off his shock, charged in after her, his pistol blazing. The tide of the battle turned in an instant. The ambushers, caught completely by surprise, broke and ran, scrambling back up the canyon walls. In less than a minute, it was over. Eliza stood in the middle of the canyon floor, breathing heavily, her knuckles bruised and bloody. Her horse was limping, but she was magnificent. She had saved them. Fletcher slid off his horse, his wounded arm throbbing. He walked over to her, his heart too full for words. He reached out with his good hand and touched her face, his thumb gently brushing a smear of dirt from her cheek. "I thought," he started, his voice thick with emotion, "I thought I'd lost you." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his. "Not yet," she whispered. But their victory was short-lived. They heard a shout from the canyon rim. It was Calloway, and he wasn't alone. He was with the rest of his men, and they weren't running. They were leveling their rifles, taking careful aim. There was no escape this time. Then another sound cut through the air. A single, clear bugle call. On the opposite rim of the canyon, a line of riders appeared, blue-coated soldiers, and at their head was a man with a silver star glinting on his chest. The U.S. Marshals. They had found them. Calloway and his men froze, caught. The Marshals had the high ground, and their rifles were steady. "Sheriff Calloway!" The lead marshal's voice boomed across the canyon. "You and your men are under arrest for arson, attempted murder, and conspiracy!" The fight was over. Really over this time. Back at the smoking ruins of his ranch, Fletcher stood with Marshal Davis, while Eliza gave her statement to another lawman, handing over the precious ledger. The book was a damning account of Blackwood's crimes, human trafficking, extortion, murder. It was more than enough. "We sent a detachment to Blackwood's ranch," Davis told Fletcher, clapping a hand on his good shoulder. "He won't be getting away. You and this woman, you've done this whole territory a great service." Fletcher looked over at Eliza. She was standing tall, her head held high, no longer looking like a woman hiding from the world. She had found her footing. She had found her voice. And in the process, she had helped him find his again. The townsfolk who had whispered and jeered now stood in silent, awe-struck groups, watching as the lawman led Calloway and his thugs away in chains. They looked at Eliza not with mockery, but with a new, grudging respect. They had all heard the story of how she had single-handedly broken the ambush in the canyon. The giant bride was a hero. That night, they took shelter in the still-standing barn. They were exhausted, bruised, and homeless. But they were alive, and they were free. They sat in the hay, the moonlight streaming through the gaps in the barn walls. Fletcher's arm was bandaged, throbbing with a dull, steady ache. "He's really gone?" Eliza asked quietly. "He's gone," Fletcher confirmed. "They all are. It's over." They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time. The silence of his life was finally gone, replaced by something warm and real. "Fletcher," she said, her voice soft. "You're home. Your ranch. I'm so sorry." He turned to look at her, her face illuminated by the silvery light. He thought of the empty house, the years of quiet despair. It hadn't been a home for a long time. It had been a tomb. "It was just wood," he said, echoing her own words back to her. "A house can be rebuilt." He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers, so strong and capable, curled around his. There was that spark again, but this time it wasn't a shock. It was a warmth that spread through his entire body. "Eliza," he said, his voice rough, "that first day at the creek, I said something stupid." She gave a small, sad smile. "It's all right. I'm used to it." "No," he insisted, squeezing her hand. "I said, this is too big. I was wrong. It was never you that was too big. It was my fear, my grief." He looked out at the moonlit land, his land, which felt his own again for the first time in years. Then he looked back at her. "The only thing that's too big here is a life without you in it." Tears welled in her eyes, shining in the moonlight. But this time, they weren't tears of sorrow or shame. He took a deep breath, the words coming from a place he thought had turned to ash. "Eliza, will you help me rebuild? Will you build a life with me? Here." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but she was smiling. A real, brilliant smile that lit up the dark barn. "Yes, Fletcher Ward," she whispered. "Yes, together." He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of wild passion, but of quiet homecoming. Two souls the world had called mistakes, two hearts that had been broken and discarded, finally finding their way home to each other. They had faced down a tyrant, saved the lost, and earned their peace. The West had called her a mistake. It had called him a fool. But together, they had found the truth. Love doesn't measure inches. It measures courage. And their courage was big enough to rebuild a world. If this story touched you, if it made you feel something deep in your chest, don't just let it end here. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell, because every week we bring you new tales that are bigger than the West itself. Stories of courage, heartbreak, and second chances that stay with you long after the video fades. When you subscribe, you're not just watching. You're joining a community that believes in love that defies ridicule, hope that rises out of despair, and people who fight to be seen when the world calls them a mistake. Every notification is an invitation to another journey, another story that will move you, surprise you, and remind you that courage always wins in the end. So, hit subscribe, tap the bell, and ride with us, because the next story might just be the one that changes how you see love, loss, and redemption forever.